Already the largest single component in the state budget, K-12 schools have experienced a dramatic increase in funding in the last 10 years with the adoption of the local control funding formula. In addition, English and math instruction has been transformed with the adoption of the Common Core standards. The question is whether these educational reforms are making a difference. We'll ask an expert in educational policy, Julien Lafortune with the Public Policy Institute of California.
BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. BNSF, the engine that connects us. Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world. From the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
California has adopted significant reforms in K-12 education over the past decade, with the expectation that student performance is going to improve as well. Our guest is Julien Lafortune, who is with the Nonpartisan Public Policy Institute, who recently authored a study entitled Achievement in California's Public Schools, What Do Test Scores Tell Us? So welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you for having me, Mark.
So let's talk first about the reforms to make sure we understand what they are. So in 2010, the state adopted something called the Common Core State Standards. Can you briefly explain what the Common Core reform was all about?
Yeah, so the Common Core reforms are really our newest set of educational standards for the state, and they reflect a broader national push to align standards across the country. And the main goal with this is to get students college and career ready for the 21st century jobs. And so these standards are really about improving the rigor of our standards, focusing on more real world applications, really trying to up our critical thinking skills for students. And you mentioned 2010 was when they were first enacted, but it really wasn't until 2015 when we first started testing students on the standards that you saw districts do.
It doesn't happen overnight. Just because you adopt the standards doesn't mean, it takes a while to kind of percolate through the system. And it's very different. I mean, their approach was on conceptual understanding, it was on problem-solving skills, not rote memorization, frankly.
Yeah.
A big change. In 2013, there were some other things that happened. That was the big thing was local control funding formula, which basically the state adopted this financial and governance reforms that really gave more kind of authority, more money and more authority to local school districts.
Yeah, and it's really just about that. It's about more money and about more authority or more freedom and flexibility in how they spend. And so this was really one of the most fundamental reforms to our system of K-12 finance over the past several decades. So in terms of the more money part, what that means is under LCFF, districts now have a weighted student funding formula. And so that amounts to giving more money to districts with more high-need kids. The idea is that these kids are a little bit more costly to educate or they have more difficult circumstances, and so we want to provide additional funding to help districts out.
I mean, talk about those high-need kids, we're talking about low-income English learners on foster care.
Foster youth and homeless individuals who are also
And in the past, the state gave money to school districts in the past, but it came with strings attached called categorical imperatives, right? So I'll give you money, but you have to use the money specifically for this purpose. And the big change here was, here's the money.
Yeah.
You do with it what you think is appropriate. Here's extra money for these high-need students.
And so a lot of times in LCFF, what we're talking about is the money aspect, but the second part, getting rid of these categoricals and giving districts a lot more leeway in their spending, is actually a big part of really what the reforms are all about.
It's kind of pushing that down to the local level.
Yeah, and the idea is that these local districts have a good sense of what their students need, and so they can respond more flexibly than, say, state policymakers in Sacramento can.
You noticed in your report that the enormity of California's K-12 education system and the fact that it's highly decentralized are among the reasons why it takes time for these changes to kind of take hold. Can you give our audience an idea of the size and scope we're talking about in the state's K-12 education system?
Yeah, I think it's important to think about just how large and decentralized the system is. So there's about 1,000 school districts in California, comprised of about 10,000 schools serving 6 million students. So say we want to change standards, like under the Common Core reforms, that amounts to changing instructional practices, materials, teacher development in hundreds of thousands of classrooms around the state. And obviously, since the system is decentralized, this takes a lot of time to actually enact locally. And so when we're thinking about what the effects of these reforms are, we kind of need to take a step back sometimes and think, there's a local implementation process, and it may take time for the full effects to really accumulate.
You're saying it's decentralized, but isn't there a State Department of Education?
So the state can't actually mandate these changes. The state can suggest that the local districts will enact these changes, but there really isn't an effective oversight tool
I
to
mean,
kind
really,
of force districts to do this.
It's the local districts, those, what did you say, a thousand?
There are 1,000 school districts.
1,000
Yeah.
school districts that are each making decisions on how to implement Common Core standards or what have you.
Yeah, they're each making decisions. Of course, there's state guidance and practices and funding that's attached to this, but, by and large, the implementation process is ultimately under local control.
You know, there are, not everybody's supportive of this. There are some critics that say that regardless, California is not making sufficient progress, especially with lower performing students. What are their specific complaints?
So I think, just broadly, I mean, the complaints are kind of all over the board, but broadly, the complaints are, one, that we have still a long ways to go. About half the kids in the state still aren't at grade level when it comes to the standards that we have under the new Common Core. Mm-hmm. And on top of that, we have these large and persistent achievement gaps that have been pretty stubborn and difficult to close over time. And so these have persisted. There are large gaps by race and socioeconomic status, ethnicity, and the fact that we haven't made sufficient progress and the rate of change isn't so fast that we might see these persist for decades longer. And so I think that's an area of concern.
When you're saying the achievement gaps, you're talking about the difference between, let's say, high needs districts where they have a lot of these kids that really need help, and these lower needs, more wealthier districts that don't. We're not closing that gap?
Exactly.
It's fast enough.
Apparently. Yeah, so I mean, these gaps are large, and even when we make progress on that, I think the rate of change suggests that it might be several years or even decades at the current rate of change that we'd expect to see these gaps eliminated.
Okay, well, while everyone wants to see improved academic performance, just how long do we have to wait to see that improved academic performance? In short, the case when it comes to educational reform, is patience a virtue or is it an excuse? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. So how well are students performing on those standardized tests that they're taking? We're speaking with Julien Lafortune. He's with the Nonpartisan Public Policy Institute of California. He recently wrote a report on that very topic. So let's talk a little bit about your report. First of all, what data did you look at and why?
So we looked at two sources of data. So the first were the SBAC, or the Smarter Balanced Assessments, and these are the assessments that California has that are aligned with the Common Core standards, and these have been in place since 2015, and they test students in grades 3 to 8 and grade 11, and they give a very comprehensive sense of how our districts are doing and how our students are doing. To supplement that and to try to compare over the longer term and to look at how California is doing relative to other states, we also looked at what's called the NAEP, or the National Assessment of Educational Progress.
You got to abbreviate these things because these things are so long.
Exactly,
right?
Yeah, it's a mouthful.
It is. So you looked at that as well to kind of compare California students to other states.
Yeah, so this is a nationally administered exam, and this allows us to compare how California is doing over time, so back several decades, and to other states as well.
Yeah, it's an older exam, I guess. It's gone back a little bit.
Yeah, so it first goes back to 1990, at least this version of it.
So how did you use these tests to determine how well California's K-12 education system is working? How do you...
So we looked primarily in our report at two things. So there's first what we'll call trend, or what we called trend in our report. So how are the trends in our educational progress? And what this means is, if we think of an example of third grade students, how are this year's third graders doing compared to last year's third graders and the year before? So it's comparing different sets of students, but it's kind of giving a sense of how the system is doing over time. Right. Are third graders more prepared than they had been in the past, and so forth? Of course, that's not the same set of students. You also might be interested in how students are progressing as they go through school. And so what we looked at is commonly referred to as growth, and so that's a second measure. And we looked at this on the SBAC tests. And what this is basically asking is, instead of comparing this year's third graders to last year's third graders, what we did is compared, say this year's fourth graders to how they did last year in third grade. How much did they grow? How much did they improve? Was that improvement more or less than what we expect given the standards and given what we think students should be learning and improving upon grade to grade?
So did you find performance improvement?
So we did. So when we looked at the trends, so just kind of how students at a given level are performing over time, what we found was actually pretty encouraging. So California has made, at least over the last 4 years, pretty broad progress in math and reading, or in English. So I think in 2015, for example, about 40% of third graders were proficient or at grade level in math and in English, a little bit less than that. And that grew actually to almost 50% over the last 4 years. And so, the rate of change is small. It's a couple percentage points per year, but that represents real progress. If you think about adding this up over time, that's hundreds of thousands of students in such a large system who are now at grade level that weren't before.
That's great.
When we looked at the grade-to-grade growth, it was more of a mixed bag. So in English, we found that grade-to-grade growth was actually pretty positive. So students, if anything, are actually catching up. So students that may have been behind in third grade, by the time they're in sixth grade, they've caught up and they're now again at grade level. And so that was a pretty robust and positive finding. On the flip side, math was a little bit less rosy. So what we found in math is that students really aren't keeping up with the grade-to-grade progression as much as we'd like, or as much as we'd expect by the standards.
Okay.
And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
One example of that is just if we look at, again, this third grade cohort in 2015, I said 40% were proficient in math in 2015. By the time we get to 2018, that same cohort in sixth grade, only 38% are proficient. So that's not a huge decline, but students are, instead of catching up, they're actually falling behind as they progress through school. And so I think that's an area of concern.
Something you have to look at more closely for sure.
Exactly.
So, but generally the scores seem to be improving. Why are they improving? I think some people would say, well, it's pretty simple. They're just teaching to the test.
Yeah, so it wasn't something we looked specifically at in our report in terms of what is generating these improvements, but I think when it comes to teaching to the test, although this is often a concern you might have when looking at test scores, I think we were reassured in this report that that really wasn't what was driving these effects. And the reason I say that is when we looked at the NAEP or this other exam, we found pretty similar effects on the NAEP as well. And the NAEP is not a high-stakes test. In fact, district and school levels test scores are never released to the public. So really what the public only gets is that it's a state-level summary of what's going on in the state of California. And so there's no incentive for a teacher to really teach to that test. So I think it provides an additional layer of confidence that the fact that we see a similar pattern there suggests that this isn't really teaching the test, and this is some sort of real improvement that we think is a little bit
they
more
don't
meaningful.
know that the test is going to be given necessarily. I mean, the NAEP doesn't give it to every student, right?
No, so it's not every student and it's not every school or district. So it's a sample of students throughout the state. I think maybe about 20,000 around the state.
Has anything been, have you reviewed whether the teaching methodology has changed somehow? It's gotten better? Does that have an effect? As opposed just say, not teaching to the test. So is there something else going on there besides Common Core or
So,
that's something that needs to be looked at.
Exactly. I think that's something that needs to be looked at. Common Core is one. I mean, what's the effect of these changes in standards? Are instructional practices getting better? I think another thing that's been going on is we've been increasing funding throughout this time period. So we've seen large increases in funding. Some of this is due to LCFF, and some is due to the improved economic situation of the state. And that may be bearing out in these scores as well. Again, that's just suggestive. That's not something we looked at specifically, but I think these are all areas that we can kind of probe further.
One of the big issues, I'm going to talk about this in a moment, is the achievement gap. And the question is it closing? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. In 2013, the state for the first time in 40 years changed the way K-12 education was being financed by California with something called the Local Control Funding Formula. The question is, has this new approach of increased flexibility and funding worked? Has it narrowed the achievement gap between traditional and high-need students? We're talking with an expert in this area, Julien Lafortune with the Nonpartisan Public Policy Institute of California. So you talk about the local control funding formula. We talked about the fact that it was given more money to high-needs districts, more flexibility on how to spend that money to those districts. But let me kind of jump to this. Has it improved academic performance, though, for high-needs students? Has it closed the achievement gap?
So in terms of has it closed the achievement gap, the answer is no. This is still a persistent achievement gap, and we haven't really made so much progress on that. But I think when we're talking about evaluating the LCFF, or the Local Control Funding Formula, it's worth noting that it hasn't really been fully funded until just a couple of years ago. And so a lot of this is still a work in progress.
So the same idea that has to percolate through the system. It takes
exactly.
a while.
And if you think the mechanism of action here, districts have to get this additional money. They have to spend it on something. A lot of what they spend it on is new staff. And these new staff initially aren't maybe as effective. They take time to get up to full speed.
Okay.
And so I think it's only after we've fully funded it and seen these kind of new staff roll through and these changes reach a sort of equilibrium that we'll start to see whether it's actually working as
everybody's
intended.
focusing on English and math, so let's talk about that. What about English and math? Have you seen improvements in English? Is it shrinking the gap in English scores for those students?
So when we looked, at least in our report, when we looked at the achievement gaps in English, what we found is that high-need districts or low-income districts aren't really seeing much higher growth than low-income or high-income districts. And so what that means is these gaps are staying roughly steady as students are progressing through school.
I guess the good news is not getting worse.
So it's not getting worse, but what we found in math is that it is getting worse as students progress through the grades. So this is a pattern that has existed before LCFF, but continues to exist, and I think that's a big worry, that as students are progressing through the system, these gaps, if anything, are either staying the same or growing.
Growing, that's a problem. If you already saw that it was a problem where it was before and it's actually getting worse, that's certainly something pretty serious. So the local control funding formula has led to some big increases in funding. We talked about that, along with this increased flexibility, how to spend the money. Some have expressed concern that given the underwhelming progress of closing the achievement gap, that maybe this additional funding is too much being spent on maybe salaries as opposed to these high-need students. What's the response?
I think those are fair concerns. I think one reason for these concerns is that districts aren't required to report school level spending, or there's no systematic accounting of spending at the school level. And so what you get are, you basically get that LCFF is working in the sense that it's giving districts with the most needy students more money. I think the questions that remain are, how are they spending this, and are they doing it in a way that's most beneficial for these high need students? I've looked at this in some part in my research, at least in terms of salary expenditures on teachers, and what we found is that high income schools or high need schools generally spend a little bit more on teachers even within the same district. And so that's a sign that districts are allocating some of this money to their most needy students, but that's only part of the picture. We don't have a comprehensive data set that can tell us what schools are spending on, because it's really only reported at the district level right now.
I would think, without any empirical evidence at my fingertips, that a good teacher makes a huge difference in the ability of students in their achievement levels in a classroom. So spending more money, higher salaries for teachers, if those teachers are good, obviously a good thing in terms of closing that achievement gap. It seemed to make sense. So I did note in your report that you're talking about the typical high need students does get about $350 more in all districts generally, and then in high needs districts they're getting $500 more directly targeted to those high needs students. So you would think that where the money is being allocated, it's going to improve outcomes. So what is your overall assessment then of local control funding formula and its ability to reach these high need students?
I think it's working as intended. I think the intention of LCFF is to provide more money to these high need kids and in the high need districts. And so the way that it's done is by targeting need at the district level. I think where there's still room for improvement is that a lot of high need students aren't necessarily in the most needy districts, or there are clusters of high need schools that are in districts that are very large and don't have as high of a percentage, and so they don't get as much additional money under the formula.
That's really interesting that you say. So you could be in a relatively well-off district, but you could have a school. In fact, I can think of some locally in the valley where the district is fairly well off, but there are schools that are not well off. They're in poor areas, but they're not getting the benefit of this.
So they'll get some additional funding, but not as much as if they were in a district that had a larger share of high need students.
Right. So it's not quite targeted specifically to all high needs students. It's targeted really to districts that have a large percentage of high need students.
Yeah, and the intention there, or the expectation, is that, or it's an acknowledgement of the fact that these areas with concentrated poverty might require additional funding. And so it's not just about giving more money for high need students, it's about giving even more when there's concentration of need.
Yeah, the concentration of need, that's kind of the focus. Well, that's interesting. Well, up next, how are California students doing compared with other states? I know a lot of parents would like to know the answer to that question. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. So how does California compare with other states when it comes to student performance? We're speaking with Julien Lafortune. He's an education expert with the nonpartisan Public Policy Institute of California. So you first compared California schools to students with our West Coast neighbors, Oregon and Washington. Why those states?
So the simple reason is that those states both take the same exam, the same SBAC exam or the Smarter Balanced exam. I think about a dozen other states right now take that exam as well, but Oregon and Washington are the two most similar to California.
Okay, well they may disagree, but whenever you go there, you're from California, right? They kind of know right away.
Yeah.
So when you compared California to Oregon and Washington, what'd you find?
So we actually compare pretty favorably to them, at least when it comes to the trends and the growth that we've seen over the past 4 years. So in Oregon and Washington, in 2015, they both started out with higher levels of achievement than California students, but we've closed the gap, at least in third grade, which we looked at in the report. We've closed the gap entirely with Oregon,
Wow.
and we've closed about half of the gap with Washington over the past 4 years.
That's pretty fast to close that gap.
Yeah, so the gap wasn't particularly large. I think it was about 5%.
I'll take it though. We closed the gap.
Yeah, so we've closed the gap, and then when it comes to the growth, we're seeing faster growth in California in both English and math than our neighbors up north are. So.
What about in math though? There seems to be some issues with math. In English they're doing pretty well, California students, but math not so well. It sounds like Oregon and Washington are doing less well.
That's pretty much the best way of putting it.
So we're catching them
Yeah.
because it's not like we're going fast. They're just not going as fast as they were going. So we're kind of closing it down.
That's exactly what's going on in math. I think our results are somewhat lackluster, but Oregon and Washington are in many ways doing worse than us. So
it's just like a race. If the other guy's slowing down, you're catching up. So when you compared California to other comparable states using the NEEP data, what did that show regarding California's changes in student achievement?
So the two most similar states to California, at least demographically and other large kind of ethnically diverse states, are Florida and Texas. And so when we looked at those two states, California in many ways has been outpacing Texas, especially in English. Math, we've seen similar trends to Texas over the past decade and a half. Florida is actually one state that's seen quite robust improvement over the past 15 years, in excess of the national average, in excess of California and Texas. And so I think that's one area that we might want to look more carefully at.
Is there any idea why that is? Why is Florida doing so well?
I think there are a lot of theories out there, but there hasn't been anything, at least that I've seen, that has really nailed this question down with an answer that's at least applicable to us in
but
California.
something we're looking at for sure.
I think that's definitely worth looking at more and taking some examples of successful policies they've had and maybe seeing if they would work here as well.
Right. So what about comparing California to the nation as a whole?
So compared to the nation as a whole, it's pretty similar to our comparison actually with Texas. So Texas has been following the national average as well. California's seen faster improvements in English. We've closed the gap with the rest of the nation by about half or 3/4, depending on how you measure it. In English, in terms of math, we've seen roughly similar growth or trends over the past 15 years. I mean, one thing that we see in California and the rest of the nation is that there was pretty robust improvement up till around 2011, and then scores have kind of stagnated since then.
That was in math?
And that's in math,
In math specifically. But it sounds generally, I'm hearing a lot of good news here, moving in the right direction. But let me ask you, how much of these improvements in student achievement you think are the result of these educational reforms like the local control funding formula or the Common Core?
I think since these improvements have been going on for a long time, we can't just pinpoint it to one reform. We've had lots of reforms over the past decade and a half. I think in terms of LCFF, the jury's still out on that because that's a relatively new reform and a lot of the money is just now being spent.
So when you're saying new, it's been around, but the money is now fully funded.
It's been around for about 6 years, but the full funding has only come in the past 2 or 3 years.
Okay. And Common Core?
And so Common Core, I think, the evidence that actually the stagnation in scores since 2011 has been suggested by some as a potential growing pain of Common Core, especially in math. I think anecdotally there are a lot of critiques over the Common Core math curriculum, that it was difficult for teachers, that it was difficult for students. In many ways, I think that's an oversimplification when we look at these math results, in part because this stagnation actually started before most districts and states had really implemented Common Core. So that may be part of it, but there's also more going on there, and there's more to that story.
It would seem to be there's a bit of a shakeout period, I would think, just to kind of get used to the new system.
I think that's true. With any sort of fundamental shift, there are going to be some growing pains.
So overall, what do you think about California? Are we going in the right direction?
I think we're headed in the right direction overall. I think the concerns you brought up earlier are still valid. We still have a long way to go. This improvement is coming off of a low base. We still have a lot of students who aren't at grade level, and there are still hundreds of thousands of students that are far below grade level. So we have a lot of work to do. These achievement gaps are large, but we've made progress over the past 4 years, and we've made progress, in looking at the NAEP over the past 15 years. And I think it's important to keep that in mind because even small gains compounded over time, 1% a year, can add up to a lot. You're talking about potentially over a decade, millions more students who are reaching grade level.
It's the compounding effect, right?
Exactly.
It's like investing. It's like you only make 7%, but that adds up over time.
Yeah. On the flip side, you're also talking about millions of students who aren't reaching their full potential. And I think that's what's important to keep in mind.
California also has a very unique demographic mix, too. It's a wide range of students. What about just focusing? I only have about 5 seconds left, but focusing on school districts that are particularly successful, is that something that people are now kind of focusing on, those high-need districts that are actually showing real improvement?
I think that's something that people want to do more of, and I think with better data, actually, that's coming or in the works. I think it'll enable us to make those comparisons with more certainty.
Yeah, more research, which is something that's good, and hopefully you'll be doing it, Julien.
That's good for me. But
that's right. Julien Lafortune with the Nonpartisan Public Policy Institute of California. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Mark Keppler from the Maddy Institute. Thank you for joining us. See you next week.